Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I think for many people, work really is reduced to toil. The toil that you have to get through in order to get a paycheck, in order to be able to somehow enjoy the weekends or get to the point where one would be retired and begin finally to enjoy life. I think there's probably many church-going people who would not think of work being a theological question at all.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Glenn Hausman, Director of Toledo Campus Ministry and Metro Toledo Churches United. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of work and spirituality. Here's Father Bacik.
Glenn, I've had the chance to talk seriously with you on a number of occasions and always enjoyed it, and have found you to always be an articulate spokesman for the Christian tradition. I wonder if, I know a little of your background. Why don't you just tell me a little bit about your training, your theological training and so on?
Yes, well, I guess the base of that, Jim, is in theology. My doctoral studies were in theological ethics. The field was theological ethics, concentrating primarily on the 18th century church-state separation thought, and traced it back to the divine right of kings and some of that kind of early background and roots for our own positions in separation of church and state in this country.
And you also know the thought of Reinhold Niebuhr quite well, which I think is an important thing for our day. I've been wanting to do a course on him sometime because I think he's so in touch with problems, that kind of political, economic problems that we should be concerned with today.
That's right. One of my minor figures in my doctoral program was Reinhold Niebuhr. I also did some work in early Puritan thought, so it's kind of a smattering of here and there throughout the.
But there's that feeling for social ethics, and that's what that you have, which I like a lot. And I think that can direct us here, because I want to talk a little bit about the topic of work, and really maybe a sort of a theology of work or a spirituality of work. And I'm not sure exactly where to begin that, except to say perhaps a lot of people wouldn't ordinarily think of work in any spiritual or theological context. I think for many people, work really is reduced to toil. The toil that you have to get through in order to get a paycheck, in order to be able to somehow enjoy the weekends or get to the point where one would be retired and begin finally to enjoy life. I think there's probably many church-going people who would not think of work being a theological question at all, that work doesn't have anything to do with spiritual life or with religious kind of concerns, or really even with God's activity, that work is just nothing but drudgery, something that you go through in life and is a secular pursuit unconnected with the whole of the spiritual life. And I suppose that kind of problem needs to be addressed early on, if indeed we're going to talk about work and spirituality.
Yes, I think, Jim, we have to understand the roots of that. It didn't just come out of nowhere that we look upon work as toil, as something unenjoyable. It came out of our theology, because there was a very strong impression in the early Puritan, New England Puritan thought that suggested that work was a way that we had of eliminating sin from our bodies. And if it was enjoyable, then it wasn't doing this task. You didn't enjoy work. Work was the toil that punished you in some sort of way for your sinfulness. And you had to be about the task of work in the Puritan thought as it came down and was refined for their ascetic purposes out of the Reformation thought, particularly of Calvin, but of others as well. There was this notion that you worked out your salvation, and that you were called into that work of God to fit into His divine plan. And the way that you knew that you were doing work was not that you were doing something that was particularly enjoyable or fulfilling to you as an individual, but the way you knew that you were doing work was that it was drudgery. And the drudgery proved then for all to see, not only yourself, but for the world to see at large, that you indeed were cleansing yourself of your sin.
I think there's probably a healthier kind of notion to be found in the Bible of work than just that one-sided notion. We might just rehearse a little bit of that, although I must say it's vague in my mind. But right in the opening chapters of Genesis, we get notions of work. And I think it's probably a sort of an ambiguous picture we get. Because first of all, the man and the woman in the garden were supposed to till the garden and work the garden even before they fell into sin. They were there, and I think there's that side of work which would be seen as rather positive and enjoyable and part of the paradise kind of situation. And then we get the other side of notion that after the fall, work becomes toil then. Then it becomes in the sweat of your brow that you will earn your living, and you get that sort of negative side of work. So I think probably right in the beginning of our Bible, we see two sides to work, and perhaps that really continues on through the whole of the biblical tradition. I could think when we look at the New Testament, we would see one thing, that Jesus is seen as the son of the carpenter, and in Mark's gospel is actually seen as the carpenter. So that we have here Jesus being a worker, and thus, from our own viewpoint, really dignifying human labor. We've got Paul's ideas there of that the worker is worthy of his hire, that if one doesn't work, one shouldn't get paid at all or cared for at all. And Paul took great pride in the fact that he was a tent maker and worked at his trade, and therefore people didn't have to support him, although he felt that the missionaries should be supported at times. So again, I guess we see a more positive notion of work in the New Testament as we would look at it. And so the biblical roots, in other words, of work probably are richer than we have usually mined, or that the Protestant ethic has really gotten hold of. Do you think you would go along with that richer idea there?
Oh, absolutely. The two threads are woven through the fabric of both the Old Testament and the New Testament. The fabric holds the vineyard, and the creator, the co-creating apparatus that God has set up with Adam and Eve in the garden sees us as caretakers, as the ones who tend the vineyard, and that vineyard theme plays out throughout the New Testament in the various parables of Jesus. He concentrates a lot upon the need to tend that vineyard, and the people in the task of tending are often used as examples by him in the parables. Also, the planting of seed, the caring for the seed as it comes to fruition, and then the harvesting. All of this is a part of that fabric, and I think the marvel is that in the traditions it's come down, and you get that in not only the formal theology, but you get it played out into kind of the lay or the folk ways of our people in the pew.
We want to expand on that a little bit, the folk ways, and what did you mean by that exactly?
Well, I think you can see that people have seen themselves as instruments of God's plan, as they have, in whatever fashion they have chosen to work it out, to be workers, to be called, to be the ones who are called of God in an overall plan that leads toward redemption, not of just individuals and persons, but of all of creation. And you see that. You see that they take pride in their work. They like to bring to the church their produce, if they be farmers or gardeners, and take great pride in what they bring. And if they didn't bring their garden goods or their baked goods or their the examples of their produce, pigs, hogs, chickens, that sort of thing, they brought their wares, what they sold, and contributed that to the church. That's always been a good tradition in the folkways, understanding as being stewards in the vineyard, of being caretakers in the garden.
And I think some people listening to that would say, boy, you're hearkening back to a previous age or a previous way of looking at things, or a more rural kind of culture, and that I think some would object, well, it's not that way anymore, that really people don't operate like that. I mean, people go in and work their 8 hours and get it over with, and they don't want to have anything to do with the company, and they're not too interested in what they produce. They're really alienated from the products of their labor, and that they really aren't into that kind of thing. They don't view their work that way anymore. That some people would say, well, that whole pride of workmanship idea is gone. I think we see an attempt to resurrect that today in relationship to the automobile industry and the whole idea of the way the Japanese have been able to produce efficient cars, and doing it because people seem to take some pride in it or have community efforts to produce a good car. And I think you see sort of the resurrection of that idea in our own country, to get back to this pride of workmanship and to feel good because we've produced a good product and so on. But I'm afraid that there's a lot of people in the culture who would hear what you were saying quite cynically and say, hey, it's not like that anymore. That's precisely what's wrong with the country, that we're not, don't have that kind of pride anymore.
I think that's absolutely correct, and I've even heard recently of one company that is rewarding its employees quite handsomely for creative ideas that save the corporation enormous costs in the future. That's another indication of this pride in workmanship. The emphasis I was trying to suggest was that this notion in our Christian heritage of being the caretakers, of being the tenders of the garden, is very much there, and still comes down to us today. We have to reinterpret it, of course. We have to see it now, and what that means, even as we make our moves back to the urban gardens, etc. We have to reinterpret what that means now, being caretakers of God's vineyard, of God's garden, in a highly urban, technological, highly mobile society. What does that mean? We live on this planet Earth. It is a rather self-contained capsule we call our environment. As we live in this kind of society now, at least in the United States, a highly urban, mobile society, what is our role as a worker now to make sure that the garden is tended and protected and secure for future generations? Now, the way that might work out is as we feel alienated, if indeed we do, in our workplace, then all kinds of personal survey can take place to find out ways that we can be indeed in touch again with the garden. And in modern times, we've seen all kinds of things happen, like, for example, various environmental groups have developed that take workers from all over the map and put them together in kind of a consumer interest group called environmentalist group that do indeed act as kind of monitors on the garden earth. And our air quality, our river pollution, our lake cleanliness, all of these become issues for us, even though we may not be taking our garden produce anymore to the sanctuary.
It's probably an encouraging sign that some of the young people seem to take an interest in these environmental questions now, and perhaps are drawing on some of those roots that you suggested. One thing I would get out of what you said is that the resources are there in the Christian tradition that to bring to bear on this problem, that we shouldn't just sit back and say, well, there's nothing you can do about this, lack of pride and workmanship and so on, but indeed that we have something to say about this. And you bring up this whole stewardship idea and the idea of tending the garden, which I think is a wonderful biblical image and perhaps could be used at least to touch some people today. I'm thinking about a person who really has done what you were calling for, and that is Teilhard de Chardin, who really tried to reinterpret the theology of work for our own time, a great Jesuit paleontologist, scientist, and religious visionary who died in 1955 and who wrote very effectively in the 20th century. His writings were published after his death and has been very influential on this whole theology of work. And one of the things he tried to fight against was the idea that work was like just basket weaving, something that we went through this life until we could just wait to get to heaven. In other words, in his own Catholic heritage, he could see a lot of this idea of saying, hey, every time you venture out into the world, you're going to come back less human. and all this work that we're doing is just sort of going through the motions here on this earth so we can really get up to the heavenly home and enjoy our happiness there. And to fight against that, he tried to point out the intrinsic value of human work of all kinds, whether it was manual labor or intellectual work or whatever kind we were doing, that indeed it was intrinsically valuable because in that very process we were co-creating the world with God, that we were helping to spread the kingdom of peace and justice and love, shalom, by our very efforts. In other words, one way of putting it was that Catholics very often thought, well, what I go through in the day isn't all that important, but if I say a morning offering, a prayer, which would dedicate that activity, then it would make it good, although in itself it wasn't all that essentially important. And Teilhard wanted to say, no, it's not based on the morning offering. It's based on the fact that the work is intrinsically valued, that it is good to be working because what are we doing? We're creating the world with God. We're in partnership with God and trying to make this a better place. Now, maybe your tending the garden image would be enriched in a way with that kind of notion that we're tending it along with God and that we have a responsibility. And what's happening in the garden is vitally important for human life now and for building the kingdom which will come to fulfillment in the future.
Yes, Jim, I think where I would have a little difficulty with Chardin at that point in the intrinsic nature of work itself being good would be at the point that we're realizing today how much work is not good, that some work does produce death, that some work indeed is self-destructive as well as destructive of society as a whole. And I think we're just beginning to get a handle on some of that. Psychologically, if an individual is unhappy in the workplace, it can indeed become self-destructive. It can lead to all kinds of trauma for the individual's family. It can lead to self-destructive kinds of mechanisms such as alcoholism, drug use, etc. And I would say, the work then in itself becomes a demonic force, and the person needs to find a way to get out of it. On the other hand, I'm particularly concerned that we're seeing so much work around our military-industrial complex today, in which the work seems to be in itself producing death for the future. As we create more and more nuclear bombs, as we create more and more nuclear submarines, as we possibly even creating nuclear power plants. Those we may find out in the future are death machines for us that we find no ways to eliminate.
That is a criticism well taken, Glenn. I think Chardin is often accused of being overly optimistic, and that might be one of the points where he needs to be criticized. However, I would like to think yet that it is true, if I modify my statement and say that our constructive work or our worthwhile work or the work that is not particularly negative or destructive would be this cooperative effort with God. I think that's true. Just the pure expenditure of energy, if it's done for demonic purposes or to destroy this earth or to hurt other people, surely can't be thought of as cooperation with the Creator. And therefore I think in my analysis we'd have to factor in the whole notion of sin and sinfulness, and I think purified in that way, I think there's something valuable. I mean, to show you how I might try to do that, some people who are involved in dehumanizing work probably could find more meaning in it if indeed they could see it as some sort of cooperative effort with the deity in creating the kingdom. And that may sound very theoretical, but I think that can be done in simple ways. I mean, you can have a person working in a cafeteria doing a very drudgery kind of work of filling up a plate or something and over and over, but who could bring to that situation perhaps kind comments to customers as they go by, or would see their work as an opportunity to meet different kind of people. I remember reading the account of a waitress one time who saw it in a very constructive way. Now, I've talked to people who say that waitressing is a very demeaning task. And yet I read this account of this person who turned it all around. For her, it was a creative task, a chance to meet people, to brighten people's lives, and I would say to spread the kingdom in a way. So I'm trying to defend this Teilhardian notion here as of having something valuable in it. Although I'm accepting your critique that without the factoring in the sinfulness and the destructive tendency of some work, that we're going to be in trouble with that whole theory. But I'm saying that look how you could use it and say, yeah, my job on the assembly line is important, it's intrinsically valuable, and therefore I get more out of it, I feel less alienated, and I'm prouder of what I accomplish.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a person who certainly enjoys a good restaurant and the service of a good waiter or waitress. And I'm telling my students all the time, I can see vocation in a good waiter or waitress, one who takes that job and makes a whole environment of creativity out of it. It's incredible, and I would affirm that. I would like to suggest, Jim, at this point, that there's another area of spirituality that we haven't really gotten into, and that is the spirituality of the person out of work. And we often forget that the person out of work almost loses their sense of being at the moment that they receive the pink slip or the announcement that they will no longer have a job. And I just sense at this point that we're moving, some of the more creative career development people are moving in a direction of helping us understand how to bring people back to wholeness and fulfillment again out of the depths of despair and alienation that really speaks to their human condition and spirituality.
One of the things we're going to have to help those people to see is not their intrinsic worth, isn't it, and that they remain valuable people. The other thing I think we have to do is give them some encouragement that some people at least are working to change systems and structures so that we can overcome this unemployment problem. It seems to me dedicated people would have to be working on both sides of that question if we're going to make progress. I think that another side of, and I take that well, I mean the spirituality of the unemployed certainly would be something that needs more attention, and maybe we've addressed it here slightly, but certainly we need to try to figure out ways to help people resurrect their own sense of dignity in those situations. Perhaps the support group idea and the churches being gathering points for those people would be helpful. You know, I think that highlights another aspect of spirituality of work, and that is that work is very often the way we express ourselves. It's what develops our creativity. It gets us out of ourselves. You know, I think a lot of times people, if they sit around and say, I want to be happy, or I want to be self-fulfilled, or I want to reach my potential and all this, it's sort of destructive. It seems to me good things happen when we actually get into action, when we work together. Instead of us trying to create community over at our interfaith center, the Ark, we probably will do better by working on projects together, doing things together, and then the community will come as a byproduct of that. In other words, it seems to me work has a tremendous value of getting us outside of ourselves, of aligning us with other people in a task, and really fostering our creativity. And it therefore produces a healthier spirituality and community life as more as a byproduct than as something directly sought.
I think that's true, and what I'm sensing is that the people that I talk to that are unemployed or are walking the pavements looking for jobs, is that they do need their dignity restored, and one of the ways that we can begin to do that is give them mechanisms through some. I think there are materials now available. There are techniques now available to rebuild people's self-worth, their understanding of who they are, to empower them, if you will, out of what they sense to be a powerless situation where they have lost their power. We can find through the church and other groups, we can find ways to show them that they indeed do still have power and do have ways of self-determining the direction that they will go with whatever their calling might in the future be. And a lot of that has to be systematic. It has to be a process they have to put themselves through. It's not easy, but there are courses available. There are techniques available now, very good ones that we didn't have just a few years ago. And some people in the church, some people outside the church now are using those. I would simply offer a consumer warning that when people are selecting trainers or guides or teachers in this area, they do it very carefully.
Okay, and the churches should be able to play an important role in all of that.
Yes.
You know, Glenn, one thing that comes out in all this is the idea of a worldly spirituality, really, that when we're talking about growth in the spiritual life, becoming a better Christian, it is not apart from the marketplace or apart from ordinary activities, but it has to be in the midst of that. In other words, work is a part of human existence, and often it is toilsome and drudgery and routine, no matter what our work is. We have our difficult moments, and yet it seems to have potential to bring us closer to our God. And I think that's what we have to maximize. So we have to try to develop what I would call a secular spirituality, or a worldly theology that takes account of this. And so part of what, the way I'm seeing it is that we see our work, therefore, at least the constructive side of it, as a partnership effort with our God, in which we're trying to spread the kingdom. Teilhard used to talk about the Mass upon the world, where the host was not the piece of bread as the Mass, but the real, the Eucharist would be, but that the host is the whole of our human endeavor and the whole of the world that we're trying to create. And I think that sort of becomes a symbol, therefore, of what do we have to offer to God, not just our prayers, but our activities as well. And I think that when we're about that business, then it gives us greater sensitivity to those who are unemployed and don't have that opportunity. And maybe it also reminds us again of the way that work can be creative for us, the way it lifts us out of ourselves and forces us to develop our talents and to come closer to our God as we become more fulfilled human beings.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Glenn Hossman, director of Toledo Campus Ministry and Metro Toledo Churches United. The topic of this week's Reflections was work and spirituality. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.